The sun beat down on the parched earth, kicking up plumes of dust with every weary step of Jacob's horse. He squinted against the glare, his gaze fixed on the distant outline of the ranch. This was it. The $1 ranch. An absurd sum for a stretch of land, even out here in the desolate expanse of the frontier. But the lawyer's letter had been clear. A peculiar clause in a will. A burden shed for a pittance. For Jacob, a former lawman haunted by the violence he'd witnessed and inflicted, it was less about the land and more about the promise of absolute solitude. No more bustling streets, no more whispered accusations, just the endless, indifferent sky and the quiet turning of the earth. His rifle rested easy in its scabbard, a familiar weight. He was ready to disappear. As he drew closer, the ranch emerged from the shimmering heat haze, a cluster of sun-baked buildings, weathered but surprisingly intact. The main house, a single-story structure of rough-hewn timber, stood sentinel amidst a few smaller outbuildings. No smoke rose from the chimney, no animals grazed in the parched corrals. It looked deserted, exactly as he'd hoped. A wave of relief, potent and immediate, washed over him. This was his refuge. He dismounted, the creak of his saddle a loud protest in the stillness. The only sound was the wind, a lonely whisper through the dry grass. He walked towards the house, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The front door stood slightly ajar, as if inviting the breeze. Strange. He pushed it open slowly, revealing a cool, shadowed interior. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light piercing the boarded-up windows. The air was stale, yet not entirely stagnant. It lacked the heavy, dead scent of a long-abandoned place. He moved deeper, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. The main room was simple. A stone fireplace, a rough table, empty shelves. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust, consistent with an empty house. Yet, something pricked at him. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of wood smoke, recent and lingering, hung in the air. He frowned. It should be gone by now. Jacob moved to the kitchen. Here, the signs were more unsettling. A single, clean tin cup sat on the draining board beside a small basin, as if recently used. A half-eaten loaf of bread, surprisingly fresh, sat wrapped in a cloth on the counter. His gaze sharpened. He approached the cold stove. The ash in the firebox was undisturbed, but it too seemed recent. Too recent for a house that had supposedly been empty for months. A shiver, unrelated to the coolness of the room, ran down his spine. The solitude he craved was beginning to feel observed. He couldn't shake the unnerving feeling that he wasn't alone, that the house was holding its breath. He ventured further, down a short hallway. 2 bedrooms, both simple, both covered in dust. He pushed open the door to the third room, a smaller one at the back. It was darker, the window tightly shuttered. As his eyes adjusted, he saw it. A narrow cot, neatly made, with a single quilt folded at its foot. On a small makeshift table beside it sat a half-burned candle and a well-worn book. No dust here. This room was clearly, unequivocally, lived in. His sense of unease curdled into a cold dread. He was not alone. The ranch, his sanctuary, was already occupied. He felt a surge of betrayal, a violation of the isolation he had paid for. A sudden, faint creak behind him. Jacob spun around, his hand flying to his pistol. Standing in the doorway, framed against the dusty light of the hallway, was a figure. A young woman. Ilara. Her clothes were simple, faded, but clean. Her hair, the color of dry straw, was pulled back from a face smudged with dirt. But her eyes, wide, dark, and filled with a fierce, desperate wariness, were fixed on him. In her hands, she clutched a heavy, rusted garden hoe, held not casually, but like a weapon, its sharp edge glinting menacingly in the dim light. "Jacob, who are you? What are you doing in my house?" His voice, accustomed to the quiet, sounded gruff, accusatory. Ilara didn't answer. Her eyes darted from his face to his hand resting on his pistol, then to the deed clutched in his other hand. Her grip on the hoe tightened, her knuckles white. She didn't flinch, didn't back down. There was a raw, primal fear in her posture, but beneath it, an unyielding defiance. Jacob took a step forward, brandishing the crumpled deed. It was his proof, his right. He was the owner. She had no claim here. But as he looked at her, at the absolute refusal in her eyes, he knew words wouldn't work. She wasn't an intruder, she was a sentinel, a guardian protecting something he couldn't yet comprehend. He had bought a ranch for $1, seeking solitude, and instead found a fierce, wild creature fiercely guarding its lair. The air thickened with unspoken challenges, the silence between them taut with hostility. He, the legal owner, she, the mysterious occupant. Neither would yield. The ranch, supposedly his, was already claimed, not by law, but by a deeper, unknown secret. The morning sun, unforgiving and bright, streamed into the ranch house, illuminating the tense silence. Jacob and Ilara stood frozen, locked in a stalemate. He held the deed, crumpled but clear, a testament to his legal right. She clutched the hoe, a symbol of her desperate, unyielding claim. Neither spoke, neither moved. The air was thick with the weight of their conflicting wills. Finally, Jacob, with a slow, deliberate movement, tucked the deed into his pocket. He didn't back down, but he acknowledged the futility of immediate confrontation. He turned and walked out of the house, the door creaking shut behind him, leaving Ilara alone in the shadowed silence. She remained rooted to her spot, listening to the crunch of his boots on the gravel, her shoulders only relaxing slightly when the sounds faded into the vast, open quiet. For the next few days, a silent, uneasy truce settled over the ranch. Jacob began to work the land, a desperate need for purpose driving him. He cleared brush from the overgrown fields, mended broken sections of the corral, his movements efficient and tireless. He saw Ilara only in glimpses, a flicker of movement at a window, the brief appearance of her silhouette against the rising sun as she emerged from the house to collect water from the well. She moved like a phantom, swift and silent, always retreating before he could approach. He never called out, never tried to force an encounter. He knew the futility of it. The ranch, once his dream of solitude, had become a shared, guarded space, each of them a wary animal staking out their territory. Jacob noticed her patterns. She meticulously maintained the house, and a small, fenced-off patch of earth near the back door. Her laundry, hung on a line, fluttered in the breeze, simple cotton pieces that belied her fierce demeanor. But the strangest observation was her confinement. She never ventured beyond the property's dilapidated fence line. His work often took him to the distant corners of the ranch, and he watched for her, a curiosity growing alongside his irritation. She was always within sight of the house, as if bound to it by an invisible tether. The few times he ventured near the house during his work, he'd find the door firmly latched, a subtle barricade erected against his presence. It was clear she was not merely protecting her space, she was protecting herself from the outside world, or perhaps from the world discovering her. One sweltering afternoon, while repairing a section of fallen fence near the western boundary, Jacob stumbled upon it. Tucked away beneath the shade of a lone, twisted mesquite tree was a small, well-tended plot of earth. A simple wooden cross, weathered but clearly cared for, marked the head. There was no name etched into the wood, just a single small stone placed at its base. It was a grave, and around it a scattering of fresh wildflowers. He stood for a long moment, the sun beating down on his neck, his earlier annoyance replaced by a chilling realization. This was why she was here. This was her anchor. The discovery deepened the mystery around Ilara, adding a profound, melancholic layer to her fierce protectiveness. The ranch wasn't just a house to her, it was hallowed ground. Later that evening, after the heat had softened into a gentle twilight, Jacob saw her at the grave. She knelt, her head bowed, her silhouette stark against the fading light. There was no sound, no discernible movement, but the raw grief emanating from her was almost palpable, a silent scream across the expanse of the yard. He watched from the shadows of the stable, unseen, a knot tightening in his gut. The silent woman, the guardian of a forgotten grave, her story was clearly far more complex than he could have imagined. He had sought simple isolation, and instead, he had stumbled upon a deeply held sorrow. The practicalities of living on the same isolated property forced small, grudging exchanges. One evening, After a particularly long day of mending fences under the scorching sun, Jacob returned to the house, his throat parched. On the porch, he found a full bucket of cool, clean water, freshly drawn from the well, sitting beside the pump. A clean rag was draped over the top. Ilara was nowhere in sight, but her presence was undeniable. It wasn't a gesture of kindness, not yet. It was a pragmatic act, an acknowledgement of his labor, a silent offering born of shared necessity on the frontier. He drank deeply, the water a cool balm. He left the empty bucket by the well, a silent acknowledgement in return. Another day, a section of the small fenced-off garden near the house, where Ilara cultivated a few scraggly vegetables, lay damaged by a stray gust of wind. A single, critical fence post had splintered, leaving a vulnerable gap. Jacob, working nearby, hesitated. It wasn't his concern, but he saw the way Ilara had looked at it. Her shoulders slumped with a rare moment of defeat. Without a word, he retrieved a spare post from his own supplies, along with his tools. He worked quickly, efficiently, repairing the damage. He didn't look at her, didn't wait for a reaction. He simply fixed it and moved on. Later, from a distance, he saw her inspecting his work. She touched the new post, her fingers tracing the rough wood. A faint, almost imperceptible nod of her head. No words. None needed. As weeks turned into a quiet routine, Jacob occasionally saw glimpses of her private world. One blustery afternoon, he was fetching water from the well when he noticed her sitting by the kitchen window, facing away from him. The light fell on her face, revealing a vulnerability he hadn't witnessed before. She was holding a small, faded tintype photograph, its edges softened with age. Her thumb caressed the image gently, a faint, melancholic hum, barely audible even from his distance. Her eyes, fixed on the picture, were clouded with a profound sadness, a deep, silent ache that transcended her usual guardedness. It was a fleeting, unguarded moment of raw grief, a window into a past she held close. He saw the way her shoulders trembled almost imperceptibly, the way she clutched the photograph to her chest as if it contained all the fragile memories she possessed. He saw the lines of sorrow around her mouth, the subtle clench of her jaw. It was a pain he understood, a silent burden mirroring his own. He paused, his bucket heavy, watching her, a profound curiosity blooming within him. Who was in that picture? What tragedy had rooted her to this isolated ranch, guarding a nameless grave and a silent sorrow? Before he could move, before she could sense his presence, she suddenly stiffened, her head snapping up. Her eyes, though not directly on him, seemed to sense his gaze. In an instant, the photograph was gone, tucked away, and her face became a mask of resolute stillness once more. She was a ghost, haunted by unseen memories, living a life of self-imposed imprisonment. Jacob returned to his chores, but the image of her vulnerability, the unanswered questions, lingered. The ranch wasn't just a desolate piece of land, it was a sanctuary for a deeply wounded soul, and he, the accidental owner, was now a reluctant witness to its secrets. A week of relentless oppressive heat had baked the land, turning the vast plains into a tinderbox. The sky hung low and heavy, a bruised purple promising a storm, but not the kind that brought relief. Jacob, shirtless, his back slick with sweat, hammered a loose plank onto the stable wall, his movements fueled by a simmering unease. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that precedes chaos. Ilara was inside the house, but he could feel her presence, a silent barometer of the rising tension. The brief, unspoken truce had softened the harsh edges of their cohabitation, yet the great, looming secret that kept her bound to this land remained a palpable barrier between them. Suddenly, a distant flicker on the horizon caught Jacob's eye, a faint wisp of smoke, almost imperceptible against the hazy sky. His blood ran cold. He knew that sight. It wasn't a campfire. It was a grass fire, pushed by the rising wind, a monstrous, hungry beast devouring everything in its path. He dropped his hammer, his mind racing. The ranch, parched and vulnerable, lay directly in its path. He ran towards the house, his shouts guttural, urgent, barely audible above the sudden, furious gusting of the wind. Alara appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with alarm, drawn by the frantic energy in his movements. She followed his gaze to the horizon, and her face went ashen. "Jacob, fire! It's coming fast!" His voice was raw, etched with the memory of other battles, other losses. Alara didn't hesitate. Her fear, usually directed at people, was now replaced by a primal need to protect this place. She didn't question his urgency. She trusted the grim certainty in his voice. She pointed frantically towards the well, then to a stack of burlap sacks by the stable. Her eyes, usually so guarded, pleaded for him to understand. Water, wet the sacks. Without a word, Jacob grabbed buckets, hauling water from the well at a furious pace. Alara, despite her slender frame, worked with a fierce, surprising strength, soaking the sacks, dragging them towards the nearest fence line, a desperate fire break. The crackling roar of the approaching fire grew louder, a hungry beast devouring the dry grass. Embers, like angry red insects, began to drift on the wind, landing on the roof. On the dry ground near the house, Jacob fought a small, dangerous blaze near the stable, beating at it with a wet sack, his muscles screaming. Alara, seeing a spark ignite on the dry shingles of the roof, scrambled up a rickety ladder he kept propped against the house, armed with a wet cloth, furiously dousing the embers. A wave of searing heat washed over them, the air filled with smoke, stinging their eyes, making their lungs ache. The fire was close now, a terrifying orange maw devouring the horizon. Jacob saw a section of fence, critical to diverting the flames around the main outbuilding, about to give way. He looked at Alara, who was desperately trying to beat back a new flare-up near the kitchen door. He needed her to understand, to trust him. He pointed emphatically at the fence, then mimed a quick, decisive pull. He needed her to pull the support beam clear so he could collapse the section, creating a wider gap. Her eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion, met his. She understood. With a guttural cry of effort, she heaved against the beam, her strength surprising. It groaned, then came free, allowing Jacob to kick the section of fence down, creating a crucial break in the path of the flames. The fire roared past them, diverted just enough by their desperate efforts. Its heat scorching, its noise deafening. It skirted the immediate ranch buildings, consuming the dry land beyond, leaving behind a smoking, blackened scar. When the immediate danger had passed, leaving them gasping, soot-stained, and trembling, they collapsed onto the porch. The air was thick with smoke, but the terrifying roar had receded into a distant crackle. They looked at each other, exhaustion etched into their faces, but also a raw, visceral understanding. They had faced death together. They had trusted each other with their lives. The walls, built of suspicion and unspoken pain, had finally crumbled. Alara, her voice hoarse from the smoke, her eyes still red-rimmed, was the first to break the silence, though her words were a mere whisper. She traced patterns in the soot on the porch floor. Jacob waited, his gaze gentle, patient. He knew this was it, the moment of revelation. Alara. The fire. It was like that other time. Hot, unstoppable. She paused, gathering her courage, her gaze fixed on the blackened earth beyond their haven. Jacob listened, utterly still. Alara. This ranch. It belonged to the Andersons. They were good people. Kind. They took me in when I had nowhere else. They were like family. Especially little Lily. She loved this place. Her voice cracked on the name. Jacob's eyes flickered to the small nameless grave by the mesquite tree. He didn't interrupt. Alara. But Silas Thorne wanted this land. He always did. He's a powerful man, ruthless. He tried to buy them out, but they refused. This ranch meant everything to them. He set a fire, just like this, only that time, it was the house. He wanted to drive them off, but it got out of control. Her hands clenched, trembling. The raw horror of the memory was etched on her face. Jacob felt a cold knot of fury begin to form in his gut. He knew men like Thorne. He'd hunted them before. Alara, Mr. Anderson, he was dying, burnt. He knew Thorne had done it. He made me promise. He said, "Don't let Thorne get it." Not this land, not this house. Promise me, Ilara. He knew Thorn would try to claim it once they were gone. She finally looked at Jacob, her eyes pleading for understanding. Ilara, the lawyer, Mr. Henderson. He was a good man. He knew the truth. He drew up a will with a clause that if a relative couldn't be found, the ranch had to be sold for $1 to a stranger. It was the only way to keep it out of Thorn's hands, to make sure no one could connect it to the Andersons. The $1 was just a legal formality to get the deed out, to pass the burden, so I stayed. I had to. I promised. She gestured vaguely towards the house, then to the grave. It wasn't just a promise, it was a sacred vow, a life sentence she had willingly accepted. Jacob's gaze hardened. He understood now. The $1, the empty house that wasn't empty, the grave. Ilara's fear of the outside world wasn't paranoia. It was a deep, justifiable terror of a powerful, dangerous man. Her vigilance was not a choice, but a desperate act of remembrance and protection. His own past, the violence he'd tried to escape, suddenly felt intrinsically linked to hers. He was no longer just the owner, he was now entangled in her secret, in her burden. He saw her eyes drift towards a loose floorboard near the fireplace, a subtle, almost imperceptible glance. Ilara, there's proof. In there. Letters. A diary. Mr. Anderson kept everything. She gestured again, with a tiny, almost imperceptible nod towards the loose board. It was her final act of trust, opening the deepest secret of the house, of her past, to him. Jacob knelt, his fingers finding the edge of the board. It lifted with a soft sigh of displaced dust. Beneath it lay a small, tin box, old and tarnished. The locked room was finally open. He pulled it out, feeling the weight of the past, the truth, nestled within its cold metal. Their gazes met, a silent acknowledgement of their shared purpose. The ranch was no longer just a burden for her, or a refuge for him. It was a battleground, and they were now allies. The embers of the grass fire were long cold, but the heat of newfound purpose burned within Jacob. The old tin box rested on the kitchen table, its contents, faded letters, a leather-bound diary, and a few official-looking documents, spread out before them. Ilara, no longer shrinking from the light, sat opposite him, her gaze clear, resolute. The truth, raw and painful, had brought not just understanding, but a shared objective. Silas Thorn, the ruthless figure from her past, would finally face justice. Jacob, his mind sharp and tactical, felt a familiar resolve settle over him. His past as a lawman, the skills he'd tried to bury, now found a new, noble purpose, protecting Ilara and the home she had so fiercely guarded. The next morning, Jacob rode into the dusty town alone. He carried the tin box, its weight feeling significant and righteous. He found Sheriff Brody in his office, a man of quiet authority. Jacob laid out the evidence. The diary entries detailing Thorn's threats, the letters hinting at the arson, and the peculiar will clause that had allowed the $1 sale. He spoke calmly, methodically, weaving Ilara's story with the cold facts. Sheriff Brody listened, his expression grim, occasionally nodding. He knew Thorn, knew his reputation, but hard evidence had always been elusive. This, however, was different. This was proof. A few days later, Thorn, confident in his untouchable status, arrived at the ranch unannounced, a sneer on his face. He found Jacob and Ilara waiting on the porch, not in fear, but with an unnerving calm. Just as Thorn began his usual bluster, a dust cloud on the horizon announced the arrival of Sheriff Brody and 2 deputies. Thorn's face, usually so composed, paled. The sheriff, with quiet authority, presented the evidence. Thorn tried to deny, to threaten, but the weight of the documented truth, combined with Ilara's steady, unwavering gaze, broke him. He was led away, his final hateful glance at the ranch falling on Ilara, who stood tall beside Jacob, a silent testament to their unbreakable unity. The victory wasn't loud or violent, but intelligent and deeply satisfying, a quiet reclaiming of what was rightfully theirs. With Thorn gone, a profound sense of peace settled over the ranch. The air, once thick with unspoken secrets, now felt lighter, breathable. Jacob and Alara began to work not as wary cohabitants, but as partners. They started with the neglected garden. Together, they cleared the scorched earth, Jacob turning the soil with powerful strokes, Alara carefully planting seeds, her touch gentle and nurturing. They mended fences, painted the faded trim of the house a fresh, pale blue, their movements in sync, their unspoken communication flowing easily. The ranch was no longer a monument to past sorrow, but a canvas for a shared future. It was being born anew, with their hands, their hopes. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, they walked hand in hand to the small grave beneath the mesquite tree. The wooden cross, now replaced by a simple, sturdy stone carved by Jacob with a delicate Lily Anderson and a small flower, stood as a testament. They brought fresh wildflowers, Alara kneeling to place them carefully. There were no tears, only a profound peace. The promise had been kept, not by fear, but by love. The ranch was safe. Jacob stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. He felt a quiet joy he hadn't known was possible, a sense of belonging deeper than any solitude he had sought. They returned to the porch, settling onto the worn wooden swing. The crickets began their nightly chorus, the only sound accompanying the vast quiet. Jacob turned to her, his heart full, the words forming slowly, thoughtfully. He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Jacob, Alara, this ranch, it was a burden, a secret, but you made it a promise. You made it something worth fighting for. He paused, his gaze earnest, vulnerable. Jacob, I came here to forget, to be alone, but I found you. And now, this isn't just a ranch I bought for $1. This is home. And it's only home because you're here. He squeezed her hand gently, his eyes searching hers. Jacob, stay. Not as a guardian to a ghost. Stay as my partner. Build this life with me. Alara's eyes, bright with unshed tears, met his. She didn't need to speak. Her smile, radiant and pure, was all the answer he needed. She leaned her head on his shoulder, a profound sense of peace washing over her. The fears, the promises, the years of solitary vigilance, all receded, replaced by the warmth of his presence, the quiet strength of his love. She had found her home, not in the walls of the house she had protected, but in the man who stood beside her. The final shot. The sun sets over the reclaimed ranch. Jacob and Alara sit side by side on the porch swing, silhouetted against the deepening twilight. He has an arm around her, and her head rests comfortably on his shoulder. Their newly planted garden stretches out before them, a symbol of growth and new life. The house, freshly painted, stands proud and solid. It is no longer a prison, no longer haunted by secrets, but a warm, welcoming beacon in the vast frontier, filled with light, laughter, and the promise of a shared future, built on a foundation of trust and love.